Hello, and welcome to the week one online recording of my summer scramble class, Glory to God Alone, the story of the Protestant Reformation. Last summer I had the privilege of teaching a course on Christian history within the Roman period, going all the way from a rather obscure cult to persecuted minority to universally accepted sanctioned church to ended up being the official church of the strongest empire of the classical world. Well, this summer I'm going to be kind of continuing that same story, talking about the Protestant Reformation. And so I want to examine, what brought about the Reformation, what major events occurred during it, what were the consequences of that Reformation, who were the major important people in that event. Also want to look at the often overlooked Anabaptist movement that began during this period and even before, and just make the class as practical as possible for what we see today. So let's get started with week one. And this is the Europe that the reformers would have known at the time. This is Europe around the year 1500. And you probably know that people like Martin Luther were born in Germany, what is today Germany. At that time was called the Holy Roman Empire, which is a bit of a confusing name, and I'll explain why. So, before we start talking about the reformers like Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and Knox and whoever else, we need to set up a little bit of backstory as to how we got to that stage where reform was so badly needed in the church. And to do that, we need to go all the way back to the fall of Rome. The official date for the fall of the Roman Empire, at least in the West, is usually given as 476 AD. Now, the Roman Empire fell apart for a variety of reasons. One of the most prominent ones, of course, is the migration of major, what the Romans called barbarians, which basically just means foreigners, into their lands, attacking Roman cities and defeating their armies, and eventually causing the western half of the Roman Empire to collapse, while the eastern half kept going. Now, eventually, this period of time after the fall of the Western Roman Empire became known as the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, you may hear it called. This was obviously invented after the time of after the Middle Ages. Basically, it means that we have the classical period, the Greeks and the Romans, and then we have the modern period, which is, I guess whenever you're living, and then the Middle Ages is the part in the middle between them. Usually the end of the Middle Ages is given as somewhere around the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Some countries mark it as when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. There's various events you can mark as the end of the Middle Ages, but that's kind of the period that we're talking about. Now, during this time, Europe was very much a fragmented continent. There were no big empires or even large kingdoms for a long time. And it took a while for civilization to kind of, rebound, I guess, a little bit. A lot of your Roman technology and knowledge was lost. And instead, Western Europe looked a bit like this, with lots of different ethnic groups settling into new homes coming from the east. Now, the first event we'll talk about is the creation of the Frankish kingdom. In the late 5th century, there was a Frankish warlord named Clovis, who succeeded in subduing the other Frankish tribes who had come to live in Gaul, the Roman province of Gaul, which is what we would call today France. And Clovis also became a Christian, well, at least in name, and was baptized, I guess, in a full suit of armor like that, which, I don't know, that looks like a cool way to get baptized, except for the sprinkling part. And then he basically created the largest post-Roman kingdom. However, when he died, his successors were not as up to the challenge as he was, and his kingdom fractured and fragmented into smaller pieces. Eventually, his dynasty was ousted and replaced by a new one, and under that dynasty, the Frankish kingdom was kind of rebuilt. And the man most responsible for that was a Frankish king named Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who you probably heard of. By 771, his work of uniting the Frankish kingdom was complete, and then he went on to expand it even further, conquering many of the other post-Roman tribes and forcing them to at least nominally become Christians, forcing them to be baptized under the penalty of death if they did not do so, or if they were caught worshiping pagan gods, which did happen at least on one occasion. By the end of Charlemagne's life, he had unified much of what was the Western Roman Empire and had become really the most powerful man in that part of the world. His sort of ultimate achievement, though, came in his twilight years, where he succeeded in helping the Pope by defeating another barbarian, well, not really barbarians now, another tribe called the Lombards, who you probably know of the Italian region called Lombardy, named after them. And in gratitude, the Pope, at a mass service on Christmas Day in the year 800, put a crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans, which was a big deal because there had been no man who had held that title for 3 centuries by that point. And it was a big piece of, sort of prestige and PR that Charlemagne gained by it. And it was passed on to his successors to be emperor. And even today, Charlemagne is remembered as sort of sometimes called the grandfather of Europe or the father of Europe, because of his influence on the creation of what would be many of the modern states to come in the future. Then Charlemagne died, and his kingdom passed to his son Louis. But when Louis was getting older, there was a problem. You see, in Frankish law, when the king, or really any nobleman, died, his possessions, his land, his titles, everything had to be equally divided among his sons. So it's not like the system we think of in the Middle Ages where, well, the king dies and then his eldest son becomes king. It's not really like that. Instead, Charlemagne's son Louis decided that on his deathbed he would divide the kingdom between his 3 sons and just give each of them a third of the kingdom to rule. And so supposedly that he made them promise not to fight each other after he was gone, and they all said, "Okay, Dad, sure, we'll do that." And then supposedly before his body was even cold from death, they were already plotting against one another and raising armies. Long story short, the 2 younger brothers, Louis and Charles, rebelled against their elder brother Lothair, who had been given the title emperor, and fought a civil war and defeated Lothair. So, in the city of Verdun, the 3 brothers, grandsons of Charlemagne, signed a treaty dividing the empire between the 3 of them permanently. So, not that they would be together anymore, but they would be 3 separate kingdoms that they would each rule as a king. So, the western portion went to one of the brothers, Louis, and that became known as West Francia, or what would eventually morph into the Kingdom of France. The eldest brother, Lothair, who also retained the title of emperor, was given Middle Francia, which didn't last all that long and eventually fragmented into lots of smaller kingdoms or territories like Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, places like that. And then in the east, which is where we are primarily concerned about, became East Francia, was given to a man named the brother named Charles. And this eventually became the Kingdom of Germany, or the foundations of it. Now, the East Frankian dynasty of Carolingian kings eventually died out. The last Carolingian king died without an heir, and the East Frankian nobles decided to do something different. Instead of just choosing a new dynasty to rule them, they decided they would start a system of electing their own kings. So when the king died, they would just elect from among themselves, no matter what dynasty that person was from, a new king. This had the advantage of not doing any of the dividing the empire over and over again between various sons. And it also avoided the uncomfortable situation where a king died early or unexpected and left his kingdom to a child, and you have to have a regency. It was often a period of weakness for that kingdom. So instead, they would just elect a full-grown, well-known, capable ruler in theory, and it worked for the most part. In 962, the East Frankian king Otto I came to prominence and again helped the Pope by protecting him from outside threats. And in return, the Pope crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. It also helped that Otto married an Italian noblewoman, which gave him vast tracts of land in northern Italy. And so once again, there was a man who was now styling himself as the new Roman emperor. So obviously, if you want to be a Roman emperor, you just have to get in good with the Pope, I guess. Otto's title eventually became the name of his realm. It took a few centuries for it to happen, but eventually the title just passed on to the entire kingdom, and it became known as the Holy Roman Empire, lasting from 962 to until Napoleon essentially destroyed it in 1806. Now, it's a confusing name, and it always kind of stumps my students at school sometimes, where it's what is that name? Well, it's holy because it allegedly has such a great relationship with the church, even though frequently it did not. It's Roman because everyone wanted to be the next Roman Empire, so that's, it has to be Roman, and it did include parts of Italy, most of it at one point. But the Holy Roman Empire is an unusual arrangement. It was a powerful kingdom, but each of the territories within the HRE, as I'll just call it for short, had a high degree of autonomy, particularly in the second half of its existence, where each territory was ruled by a prince. That's their title. And among those princes would be chosen 7 electors. And the electors had the job of electing, as the name implies, the next king every time the Holy Roman Emperor died. Now, that technically they could elect any of the princes to be the next emperor. But they often chose a weak man to be emperor, or someone with not a lot of influence, so that they themselves could have a high degree of autonomy and freedom to do what they want. And even at certain time periods, it was actually legal for various princes to actually wage wars against each other within the empire. And then they would just band together, I guess, when there was an outside threat, which they usually did, but it wasn't always that simple. And this is the coat of arms, at one point used by the Holy Roman Empire, with all the various some of them, there were more even than that, on its wings. In fact, at one point there were this many princes within the Holy Roman Empire, and it is quite a mess, really. So, with the Holy Roman Empire created, and we will then approach the time period of the Reformation. Next question we have to answer them is, what exactly made the Reformation so necessary? You might have the idea that Luther just kind of walked in and created the whole thing himself, and it's really not that way. It's more like a bonfire was sitting there and Luther just threw a bunch of matches onto it. For centuries, there had been a very obvious need for reform, and people complained about it quite frequently, even at the risk of their lives, as we'll see soon. So by the time the 1500s rolled around, the Catholic Church was very obvious that it was corrupted and needed reform. The corruption was so bad that they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. It was very open, very plain for all to see. And not just for the common people, but even monarchs complained about it, as Queen Isabella complains that the majority of the clergy are living in open concubinage, and if our justice intervenes in order to punish them, they revolt and create a scandal, and that they despise our justice to the point that they arm themselves against it. So what made this even worse is that the people who got into power often did so just by buying power. The church had a practice called simony, where a position within the Catholic Church, pretty much other than Pope, was, even then sometimes, even the Pope, could essentially be bought. And if a nobleman decided he wanted to be a bishop and wanted to rule the land associated with it, which would be called a bishopric, if he just paid the right person the right amount of money, he could have it. And often there would be men who would hold multiple bishoprics, even if that wasn't technically legal. And this happened a lot. And so, of course, the people who decide that they want to bribe the church into giving the position are not the most sincere or well-meaning, and that's, of course, going to lead to even more corruption. Now, it got so bad that the church had to come up with a special doctrine dealing with sacraments. And if you're familiar with the church, you know that, especially at that time, the church taught that in order to be a Christian, you had to be part of the church. In order to be part of the church, you had to receive various sacraments or official ceremonies, kind of like rites that could only be performed by priests. And but with so many of the priests being corrupt and openly so, the people began to be kind of concerned: is this sacrament, this mass, or whatever it is, this marriage that I'm receiving, valid, even though the priest is obviously an immoral person? So the Catholic Church had to teach that all sacraments were ex opere operato, which literally means out of the workings of the works. Which in plain English means they are good in and of themselves. They work in and of themselves. So despite the fact that it's a corrupt, immoral, priest performing mass, the mass is just as good because they are good in and of themselves. And then there was a further embarrassment to the church. Probably the most well-known embarrassment or example of corruption is the papal schism that took place from 1378 to 1414. Basically, it followed a time period where the papacy had actually been moved from Rome to France under the domination of the French kings. And the papacy, for about 76 years, I think it is, lived in Avignon, France, in southern France. And so eventually that came to an end, and the papacy was able to free itself from French influence and move back to Rome in 1378. Well, the College of Cardinals in Rome elected a new pope, but the old French pope back in Avignon was not dead yet. And so he refused to give up his title and retire, and so there were now two popes, two men who claimed to be pope, at least, and they both excommunicated each other and declared that they were the real deal. And so even various countries would back the pope or or oppose what they would call an anti-pope for political reasons. And so the powers that be decided, well, let's just have a council and we'll elect a third pope as a compromise and we'll just get rid of the other two. So they elected a third pope, but neither of the original two popes wanted to give up their power. And so now there were three popes walking around excommunicating each other. And this dragged on until 1414, when finally a fourth pope was elected. That's fourth time the charm. And all the other three were brushed aside in favor of this fourth pope. In about a century later, in 1510, the HRE Emperor Maximilian then even commissioned the writing of an official letter to be presented to the Catholic Church, listing all of the complaints or grievances that the Catholic Church had, the German nation had against the Catholic Church. And so I picked out some highlights to share with you to give you some specific examples of what people were complaining about in the years leading up to the Reformation. So this comes from the 1521 edition of this list of grievances. That was actually presented to the church. This is, of course, after the Reformation has already begun. Number 19 says, concerning papal dispensation and absolution. The author notes here, popes and bishops reserve to themselves the absolution from certain sins and cases from which, they say, only they can grant absolution. The people are not granted absolution unless much money changes hands. Certain rich individuals, however, will receive letters of indulgence from His Holiness the Pope dealing with murder, perjury, or some like misdeed to be committed at a future date. Number 21. Many benefices are acquired under the pretext of papal family relations. Now, a benefice is another name for like a papal position, like simony we were talking about earlier. The author notes, also, splendid and good benefices frequently come through the doings of officials, relatives, and courtiers of the Pope to incompetent, bad, and ignorant individuals. Number 22. Concerning indulgences. It is also most objectionable that His Holiness allows so many indulgences to be sold in the German nation. The poor, simple people are thereby misled and cheated out of their savings. We'll talk more about indulgences next week, But the bottom line is that an indulgence is like a special gift of grace that the Pope allows to be given out to people, or in this case, sold to people, that will forgive them of a sin that they've committed, or it can be purchased for a relative who is already dead in purgatory and speed up their process of getting into heaven. And then I'll just list out a few more. Number 28, how much reform is needed. Number 31, how priests arrested for their misdeeds escape punishment. This is because in those days, the priests could not be tried by a civilian court, but could only be tried by a court of clergy, in other words, by other priests. And so you can imagine the potential for corruption there. My personal favorite, number 66, some priests behave like laymen and begin brawls in taverns. Why are they there in the first place? Number 95, how innocent people who happen to live near an excommunicated person are themselves excommunicated, because apparently it was a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. Number 101, how priests withhold the sacraments for trivial offenses. So if you get on the priest's bad side, he may essentially exclude you from the church for no legitimate reason, which was a big deal because that's how you got salvation, at least how the people were taught. Moving ahead, then, with all these complaints, there were people who openly then criticized the church for things like this and called for reform before the Reformation actually began. Now, neither of them had the success that Luther did, but we will study two men who challenged the Catholic Church and had a lasting impact and even helped pave the way for future reformers. Sometimes these two guys are called the pre-reformers. You've probably heard of them. They are John Wycliffe and John Huss. Let's begin with John Wycliffe. Wycliffe was from England, and he attended the University of Oxford, became a professor. He was commissioned as a preacher and a pastor. He was a pretty well-respected guy. But he did attack the church for a number of issues. He did not approve of how the clergy lived. Of course, they're immoral and, according to his estimation, very over-the-top and opulent lifestyle. He also attacked the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, which, if you're not familiar with that, that is the doctrine that states that during communion, when the priest says a certain Latin phrase, the body and the elements, the wine and the bread, literally turn into the body and blood of Jesus Christ, and that's what the people ingest as part of the communion ceremony, instead of it representing being more of a symbolic ceremony, like we would say. But the thing that made Wycliffe really get on the nerves of his overlords is his view of the Bible. Wycliffe very clearly believed that the Bible should be something that everyone should have because it helpeth Christian men to study the gospel in that tongue in which they know best Christ's sentence. At that time, of course, the Bible was not allowed to be translated into any other language except Latin. And the Catholic Church kept a tight monopoly on who could print Bible. Well, of course, there was, for a long time, there was no printing. In Wycliffe's time, there was no printing. Who could copy Bibles, I should say, and into what languages they could be copied into, which essentially meant that there was only Bibles written in Latin. And Wycliffe believed that it should be the opposite, that people should have the Bible in the language that they actually speak, or we would call that their vernacular language. So in Germany, the vernacular is German. In French, the vernacular is French. In England, the vernacular is England, so forth and so on. And then, on top of that, Wycliffe also very strongly believed that not only should everyone be able to read the Bible, or at least hear someone read it in their own language, since most people, of course, were illiterate at this time, he also believed that the Bible was clearly the highest spiritual authority for a Christian. Now, the way this contradicted Catholic teaching is because the Catholic Church taught, and still does to some degree, that while the Bible, yes, it's a high authority, it is on an equal level with other sources of authority, such as church tradition, counseled, documents written by various church councils, and also proclamations from popes. And Wycliffe said, no, those things have to be subservient to the Bible instead. And that, of course, radically changes then what you believe in. because the Catholic Church is teaching people that its traditions are of equal authority to the Bible, which is why if you tell a Catholic, well, such and such is not in the Bible, they're not going to flinch because they're taught that, well, sure, but that's okay because it's found in this thing over here instead, whether that's a tradition or a document written or something from a pope. Wycliffe then began to practice what he preached and set about the task of actually creating an English translation of the Bible beginning in 1382. We know that he completed this Bible. He himself was probably only involved in writing the New Testament, while his students completed the Old Testament. Now, the Wycliffe Bible, as it became known, was not translated from the original languages that the Bible was written in, Hebrew and Greek or Aramaic. And this was because he didn't have access to those documents. He didn't have access to the kind of manuscripts that Bible translators would have later, or even today. So instead, he translated from the official Catholic Bible at the time, the Latin Vulgate, and as the name implies, it's written in Latin. So his Bible isn't the most precise translation ever created, but it was a lot better than what people had at the time, which was nothing. So he translated the Bible into what we would call Middle English, which is sort of the medieval, late medieval style of English, which you can kind of read, but it's a lot different than modern day English. But Wycliffe was treading on thin ice here. The Catholic Church had long ago made it very clear that no one is to possess the Old and New Testaments in the Romance language, and if anyone possesses them, he must turn them over to the local bishop within 8 days after promulgation of this decree, so that they may be burned, lest, be he a cleric or layman, he be suspected until he is cleared of all suspicion. Essentially, this is saying that you cannot write the Bible in a common language. In this case, they're talking about Romance languages like Spanish, French, Italian, something like that. And that if you are caught with a Bible, there may be some consequences. It's a little bit vague, but the position is still fairly clear. Nevertheless, Wycliffe went ahead and made his translation of the Bible. To give you a little clue as to what it was like, here is the famous verse John 3:16 in the KJV, and here is the same verse in the Wycliffe Bible. You can probably get the general gist of the verse, but obviously it doesn't flow the same way, and it's not spelled the same way, and in fact many of the letters are actually, at that time, had a different sound assigned to them, and so it's a bit different. If you've ever read or studied the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, for instance, it would be similar to a Wycliffe Bible as far as the language used. Then, in 1408, after this had gone on for a while, Wycliffe was declared a heretic, and all of his writings were banned and his Bibles burned. Now, there was a small problem with this, though. Wycliffe had been dead for over 20 years by the time the church caught up to him and declared him a heretic. Nevertheless, they dug up his bones, burned them, and spread his ashes in a river as punishment for what he had done. However, his legacy endured, and at least about 170 of his Bibles survived, and they can still be read even today, or even seen in a museum. At the same time, though, at this conference where Wycliffe was declared a heretic, the Catholic Church made absolutely clear how it felt about translating the Bible. In England, the Third Synod of Oxford, in 1408, the Catholic Church decreed, "It is dangerous to translate the text of the Holy Scriptures, since it is not easy in translations to preserve exactly the same meaning in all things. We therefore command and ordain that henceforth no one translate the text of Holy Scripture into English or any other language, under pain of excommunication. He who shall act otherwise, let him be punished as an abettor of heresy and error." Now, by using words like excommunication and heresy, the Catholic Church is essentially saying, we're not going to tolerate people who translate the Bible, and if they do, we are leaving the door open that they could be executed. This could be treated as a capital crime, essentially, for translating the Bible. But even though Wycliffe died before the church authorities could get to him, he had a stroke, actually, his legacy endured long after his death, thanks to his followers, who were nicknamed Lollards. after Wycliffe. Supposedly, this word it was an insult. It was not a name they came up for themselves. It means something to do with like stuttering or mumbling, and so it was definitely a derogatory name for these people. But the Lollards kind of rolled with it and continued to spread and copy Wycliffe's Bible and spread his teachings. But in return, they were very harshly persecuted. Many of them died for their faith, for opposing the Catholic Church, really until the coming of the Reformation, or even during it, because, of course, in England, the Reformation was quite a wild ride. We'll get to that later. And but the Lollards persisted, and here's a painting of Wycliffe sending some of them out, giving them Bibles and telling them to go spread the message of the gospel to the people. They were the Lollards who did the preaching were often called Wycliffe's poor priests, because Wycliffe believed that the priests should be humble people who should live humbly and should not be rich, like many of the Catholic priests were around him. But even beyond that, Wycliffe's ideas and writings spread even beyond England. A little bit of political intrigue. The King of England married a princess from the Holy Roman Empire from Bohemia, and as sort of like a cultural exchange, some students from Bohemia, from the University of Prague, came to Oxford to study, and they stumbled across the teachings of John Wycliffe, and they took them home with them, or at least copies of them. And a certain man named John Huss came across these writings while he was a student at the University of Prague, and became highly influenced by the writings of John Wycliffe. Huss, who was a very accomplished man in his own right, also became a professor at the same university at Prague, and began to espouse many of these same writings that Wycliffe had, same ideas that Wycliffe had been spreading. Now, for those of you who are a little bit unsure of your geography, this is Bohemia at that time. It would mostly be today's Czech Republic. So, like I said, he read John Wycliffe's writings, came to the conclusion that he agreed with a lot of it, and decided that he too would criticize the Catholic Church. Specifically, Huss came down on things like relics, indulgences, and of course also church corruption in his own homeland. A relic was some kind of material object that was closely associated with someone from the Bible, like a wisp of hair or a piece of the cross or something like that, a bone from an apostle or something, that related to that sort of thing. And the Catholic Church taught that these relics had spiritual value, that you could, if you could pray in front of it or even touch it, that it would impart grace to you and make it more likely that you would go to heaven or take off time in purgatory and that kind of thing. It was such a big deal that people would actually collect relics, or noblemen would do it. I forget who said this, but it was said that there were so many pieces of the, quote, Holy Cross in Europe that there was enough to build the Ark. So it was not an honest business, for sure. Now, Huss, his teachings really struck a nerve in Bohemia. It just so happened that area, there was a lot of political tension because the Bohemians wanted to be free of German influence and domination in the Holy Roman Empire, and they felt that Huss's teachings were justification for them to rebel. And so there was a peasant uprising in Bohemia, and it got so bad that Huss actually had to flee from Prague, and the Holy Roman Emperor ended up having to get involved, and he called a meeting in 1414 called the Council of Constance to figure out what to do with the whole peasant uprising, and also to deal with John Huss, who by this time had come really to the attention of the Catholic Church, and was suspected, of course, of heresy because of what he had said and he had written. Now, the King of Bohemia, the Emperor, actually, I should say, had given, well, the Emperor's brother was the King of Bohemia at the time, that's why I was thinking that, gave Huss a promise that if he came to the council, he would be given a promise of safety, and that he would be allowed to defend himself and to debate, essentially, is what he wanted to do. He wanted to get on a big stage and be able to debate his Catholic counterparts. However, the promise was broken after the emperor was convinced that Huss was a heretic, and so he was imprisoned instead. He was put on trial, but it was not really a fair trial at all, and he was not given much of a chance to defend himself. He was merely told that he was wrong, he was a heretic, and or at least that his ideas were heretical. And Huss told them that if they could prove from Scripture that he was wrong, that he would, bow to the council. But they couldn't do that, or weren't interested in it anyways. And so after repeated tries to get him to recant or to take back what he had said and written, the Catholic Church decided on July 6th that he was to be condemned and burned at the stake as a heretic. And even while strapped to the stake, he still refused to recant. And when asked to recant for the final time, according to witnesses, Huss said, "God is my witness that the evidence against me is false. I have never thought nor preached except with the one intention of winning men, if possible, from their sins. In the truth of the gospel I have written, taught, and preached. Today I will gladly die." And in response, however, this didn't go over very well, of course, in Bohemia after Huss's execution. A sort of second wave of rebellion broke out, and Huss had quite a following back in Bohemia, and they were called the Hussites. And they essentially declared war or independence from the Holy Roman Empire and from the Catholic Church in particular. This, of course, led to open conflict. The Pope launched 5 separate crusades against the Hussites to retake Bohemia and to reintegrate it into the Catholic fold. But the Hussites were really tenacious and were able to fend off all 5 crusades and defeat the Catholic armies who attacked them. Eventually, however, in 1434, a compromise was agreed, allowing the Hussites to continue practicing their beliefs they got from John Huss, and in return, they would officially come back into the Catholic Church and come back into the Holy Roman Empire, but they would just be kind of like given a special status as, well, they're Catholics, but they have their own version of it, so to speak. Now, later events would shatter this compromise, and the Hussites would once again be persecuted quite heavily in the next couple of centuries. But their story wasn't over. In 1722, a very tiny remnant of the Hussite movement showed up in Germany, and they established the Moravian Church because they were from the province of Moravia. They were given this land to live on by a guy named Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, a name you might have heard of. And Zinzendorf led the creation of this new church, and the Moravians became best known for their missionary work, particularly to Native Americans. The Moravians ended up sending out 265 missionaries from their bases in Saxony all over the world, but particularly to North America. In fact, John Wesley was a convert thanks to one of their missionary efforts. And they're still around even today. And even today, they still claim to be the inheritors of the movement started by John Huss. And a century after John Huss's death, Martin Luther would read his writings and declare to his friends, "I am a Hussite." And we will get to Martin Luther and his story next week in week 2. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.